Hi, I'm Susan. This is a reading from Exodus 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord."
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. They set out from Succoth and camped at Edom on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so they might travel by day and by night. From Numbers, on the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant. And from evening until morning it was over the tabernacle, having the appearance of fire. It was always so. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, then the Israelites would set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the Israelites would camp. At the command of the Lord, the Israelites would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they would remain in camp. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites would keep the charge of the Lord and would not set out.
We're going to do something a little different. I'm going to tell you why the Israelites were unhappy with Egypt. Why? It's a beautiful land. What's wrong with them? Anyway, our reading tonight is from Exodus 1, verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they sent taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all tasks that they imposed on them. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land."
The whole congregation of the Israelites set out on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, as much as each needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted.
It's been a long few days, and when, especially on brunch Sundays, I get a little punchy, so you're welcome. This is going to be interesting. I had a super long meeting on Friday, like most of the day, and then yesterday we hosted a workshop here pretty much all day. And then this morning we had brunch and kind of got back here, and I was like, I should put some pen on paper here with a sermon. That was a few hours ago, so here we go. We are in week number 2 of the series Beginning. Oh, I want to give a shout out to Marilyn and Kathy and Brandon who are online. Brandon's from West Michigan. Marilyn is in a rehab center recovering from surgery. Kathy is our pastoral resident for online community, so they're all on holding down the fort with the online crew. Caitlin or whoever else is on, feel free to shout out if they've got questions or comments. Feel free to digitally heckle me. The people in the room certainly feel free as well. So we're looking at beginning stories in order to sort of really more deeply examine starting over as both a life-giving and an impossible way of being. Life-giving in the sense that we can choose ways of being that bring us life, but then also sort of the impossibility of really starting over. That we always just sort of start from where we are. There's no such thing as like an actual clean slate. So we're working through these sort of major narratives in the Bible. So we did the Genesis creation stories last week. That was much more convenient because it's like 2 chapters and one of them's a poem. This week we're doing Exodus, which is like all the chapters. So we had a bunch of readings. They ended up sort of being out of order from what we expected, but that's actually a brilliant illustration of one of the things we're going to talk about later. So it was an accident, but it's sort of a beautiful picture of what we're going to talk about. We're particularly interested in this idea that it's not just changing external circumstances that give us a fresh start, but it is our way of being, our way of responding, interacting with the situation that can allow us to begin again. And so if you hear nothing else, this is the sermon. I'm actually going to give it to you at the very beginning, and then you can feel free to tune out or tune in, whatever you want to do. The sermon is this. It takes 40 days to get the people out of Egypt. It takes 40 years to get Egypt out of the people. So when we talk about an external shift, we talked this morning at brunch about the idea of like winning the lottery. And people go, "Oh, I'm going to wish and wait to win the lottery because if I win the lottery, that'll make me generous. I'll become the kind of person that I want to be if just I had the money that it was convenient." So like this big external walking out of Egypt, new beginning, versus the 40-year new beginning of becoming a kind of person. So the idea that it's not just the new beginning of an external or literal rescue where circumstances change, but the difficult journey of discovering who we are, our identity, formulating a rule of life, choosing a practice for living. It's not just what happens to us, but who we choose to become in the midst of what happens to us. That really is the kind of new beginning we're after. So I'm going to riff on that in a minute. But first, I want to work quickly through this framework that we've been using for this series. And so I kind of introduced this last week, but we'll work through it real quick tonight. We want to look at sort of the text, the context, ask some questions, and then finish up with some practices. One of the major themes we've been trying to sort of focus on, we want to focus on in 2018, is the idea that a congregation at its best is a school of love, which means we always have to come back to something practical, especially in a congregation like this, because we're big on intellectual rigor. We're big on the academic pursuit. We get really into things like theology and philosophy and ideas. But at some point, it has to come back to how does this make us more loving? Am I more loving? Because ideas are great, but at the end of the day, that's apparently not fixing the world. So text. The text is the Exodus story. I selected 5 readings to sort of illustrate some of the turning points in the plot that I think are important. So you've got people in slavery, and they cry out. God hears them. You've got a meal. We call the Passover. You've got the people leaving, like they walk out of Egypt. You've got the people following. They've got a cloud and a pillar. And then you've got people starving, and they get some magic bread. So Exodus story. So that's the text. The context is, and it said this in one of the readings, I think the first reading, like Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was, and probably he didn't care. So the backstory of this is that the people had gotten in the vicinity of Egypt because they had come from another land, and the reason they left the other land is because there was a famine. And so they were driven to Egypt by hunger, or we could say they were driven by a sense of scarcity. There was not enough, and they had to go to this new place to find food. And for a while, it was actually a pretty good situation in Egypt. This is a whole other sermon. We're going to get to this later in the series. But when new beginnings go bad, so there are such things as starting over in new beginnings that don't end up turning out so well. So in the Joseph story, this was a good new beginning. They were rescued from famine. They got to a new land. They were saved. But after a little while, they became slaves. So the context is slaves, oppression. This is the life they're living. They're living with this familiarity of sort of making bricks and essentially being punished with hard labor. And so the question, I think the primary question that starts to be formulated during the story of rescue, when people are in Egypt, they cry out, God says, Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And then as they're physically leaving and they come to the Red Sea, all the famous stories, the question that's coming into focus is, who are we? Who are we? And the reason that question comes into focus is because they start to realize they know who they aren't. They know they are not slaves, but they don't yet know who they are. They are fully capable of defining themselves against, but they don't know how to define themselves. So they know they're not slaves. They know they're not supposed to spend their lives just making bricks and building Pharaoh's empire. That's who they're not. But then when they get free, they're faced with a more difficult question. Who are we? Who are we? Who are we going to be? How are we going to live? So we know who we aren't. We don't yet know who we are. And for some reason, what came to my mind was no longer a girl, not yet a woman. So this is sort of the adolescence of identity. They know that they're not slaves anymore, but they don't yet know who they are. They're not fully human. So where is it, as we reflect, so we've got text, context. The questions for us, I think, might be, where is it that we need to get out of Egypt? And where is it that we need to do some work in getting Egypt out of us? So maybe what are those literal external oppressions that we need to get free from? That may be addiction, that may be relationships, that may be a dysfunctional career, whatever it is. What do we need to get out of? But then also, what do we need to get out of us? What do we need to work on exercising from our lives? And so finally, practices. Just superficially, what we see in the story is that they cry out, and then they leave, and then they wander. So in some sense, these are healthy practices. And we can sort of talk a little bit about that. But the sermon is, how do we practice leaving Egypt? How do we practice getting Egypt out of us? So I want us to begin with those two questions. Where is it that we need external liberation, where we can kind of look at our lives and go, this is unhealthy, this is dysfunctional, I need to remove myself from this situation, I need to be free from this. And then the more difficult, where is it that we need internal liberation? There's some things that I need to not carry with me anymore. And I think part of what we wanted to introduce you to in the meditation is that there are things that it's okay to let go of. It's okay to be free of. Maybe not just the list itself, but the anxiety behind the list. A lot of you are good to admit the fear behind the list of letting people down. my anxiety of I can't trust the system of my own mind to capture everything I need to do, and so I'm afraid I'm going to forget. But what's behind that is if I forget, then I can't keep everyone happy. And if I don't keep everybody happy, how can I be loved, right? So it's MLK weekend, and I think part of what we have to be reminded of is that it's always both and. And I think when we gravitate towards a binary, we miss it. And I think part of what has robbed the Christian tradition of power, especially when it's closest to being what it ought to be, is the very human desire to polarize, to say that it's either all external or it's all internal, right? And so what Jesus is about is either only liberating us from something inside, whether that's our own self-destruction or sin or whatever the language is. It's just about an internal liberation. Or that it doesn't have anything to do with setting us free from the dysfunction inside, and it just has to do with curing society of its ills. It can't ever be either or. It's always both and I think we know deep down that if we want to see macro level change and restoration and redemption and justice, it has to begin with us. Because the truth is, if Jesus waved the magic wand right now and made everything external the way it ought to be, we would screw it up because we haven't done the work inside yet. We would take it right back to where it is. It has to be both and it has to work together. And I think that's maybe like the big picture of the Exodus story, is that there's a walking out of external bondage and oppression, and there's a living out of figuring out who we are and how we're supposed to be. So we have to leave Egypt. So we have to leave systems and empires and powers, especially in this week, powers of racism. We have to pick up the mantle of leaders like Jesus and Dr. King and resist injustice and resist sort of the ills of society. But we also have to see and name, to your point, Jurgen, and acknowledge parts of ourselves that have to get out, that we've got to let go. The lists that we have to let sort of dissipate, from which we need liberation, not only external but internal. And we can't minimize, especially on weekends like this, the inescapable demand at the heart of our sacred text to do the kind of justice that literally sets people free. Slaves and prisoners and those in debt and the poor and the infirm and the sick and the homeless and the orphan and the widow and the stranger and the foreigner and the other and the naked and the refugee. Over and over and over in our text and in our tradition, it is love these people, set these people free. And at some level, even if you've got a running list and you haven't overcome all the junk that's going on inside of you, that doesn't mean you're not also still obligated to set people free. You don't get an option in that. It's the call of justice. It's the work Freddie's doing and inviting us to do with him. We have to set people free from whatever it is in which people are in bondage and oppression. The unavoidable call of the text and tradition, let my people go. Set them free, walk together out of Egypt, or whatever it is. It's the heart of the dream of Dr. King, and it's still the overarching narrative of our scriptures: freedom, equality, humanity, justice, love. This is us. This is our tradition. We can and must heed this call and do this work. Please. Even from shithole countries, God bless. Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember who it was. Somebody sent me an article that was, Dave. Blessed are the shithole countries. Yeah, the Beatitudes. Yeah, right? Who does Jesus care about and what is Jesus aligned with? Yeah. How could anything good come out of Nazareth? That shithole. Don't you dare. Nope, don't listen. Whatever the sermon was, it wasn't as important as that comment. In fact, I think maybe it was that comment. So we've got to do that work. That's our tradition. We have to set people free from injustice, external oppression. At the same time, we have to see that and granted I only gave you a few plot points, but the entire story of the Exodus, and this being the primary formative narrative of Israel, which by the way means of Jesus, the story of the Exodus has just as much, if not more, wandering as it does leaving. So there is the physically leaving, but then there is a lot of wandering. They spend as much time figuring out who they are as they do walking away from who they are not. They are no longer slaves, but who are they? They spend years wandering in the wilderness, and they're no longer being liberated from slavery in Egypt, but they are being liberated from slavery in themselves. I don't know if this works, but it's one of my favorite stories, so I'm going to tell it. And it's Pete Rollins, so I'll put $1 in the swear jar. This is, and I know that he actually stole it from one of my favorite books called Plato and the Platypus, which is about sort of continental philosophy through jokes. But the story is there's a guy who goes for psychoanalysis, and he tells the analyst that he thinks that he is chicken feed, and he's terrified because he has a neighbor that has chickens. He says, I'm chicken seed, and I'm terrified. My neighbor's chickens are going to get loose, or they're going to come over. They're going to eat me, and I can't leave my house. I can't get out of bed. I'm a mess. I'm a wreck. And he does months of analysis, and he's getting better, and he's getting better. And one day he gets to the point where he says to the analyst, I think I'm well. I think I'm cured. I know that I'm not seed. I know I'm not chicken feed. I know that even if the chickens get loose, it's not an issue because I'm not chicken seed. And the next day he's back in the office and he's dripping wet with sweat. He is a nervous wreck. And the analyst says, what happened? What happened? You're doing so well and you'd been cured. And he said, yeah, but I got home and I realized that I know I'm not seed, but do the chickens know it? And I think at some level, that dichotomy of getting out of the external that's oppressing us, and whether or not that ever registers with us on the inside. I'm free from Egypt, but did the Egyptians know that? And so we keep living as if, and we just sort of externalize our internal problems. We go, oh, that's somebody else. So I just want to, there's so much good stuff. And I think this, part of what I realized is we could do an entire series just on Exodus and how this stuff sort of unfolds. But I want to just riff on a couple of these kind of themes, because I think, especially related to the new beginning stories we see in Exodus, and both the liberation and formation. And I'm going to use the same language of leaving, because I think it's powerful because it's a verb. It invokes, like Shelley said, it invokes the courage to do something about what we're talking about and not just to realize it about ourselves. So first, leaving slavery for freedom. And I think another way we could put this, and this is going to reflect on sort of this inner work that we need to do, is finding ways that we can convince ourselves that we're human. Because at some level, leaving slavery for freedom is about leaving in humanity. It's about acknowledging our own dignity. Because I don't think we can ever really acknowledge the dignity and humanity and goodness of other people if we can't see it and acknowledge it in ourselves. And this is back to kind of what Jerry said, that the narrative is people who build bricks. And it's not only, the problem is it gets to the point where it is not only what they do, it is who they are. That becomes their identity, that they are people who produce. And they are separated from any sense of being, and they are only what they do. And this is why you see throughout the scriptures the importance of Sabbath, the importance of rest, the importance of working into the rhythm of the life of a human, a day where you become valuable beyond what you produce, where you have dignity beyond your ability to earn it, where if you don't do anything for anyone, you still are worthy of love. You have innate goodness, dignity, value. You're more than what you do, what you produce, what you achieve, what you manufacture. You have worth as a being and not only as a doing. I think Bill said at Occupy Trilogy, I can't let my happiness rise and fall on my successes and failures. That is a way of saying I am more than what I do, or, back to our internal monologues, what I fail to do. And yet that is at the heart of most of our monologues. Our monologues aren't, it would be great if I achieve what I'm hoping for. It would not be great if I don't achieve what I'm hoping for, but ultimately I'm of value. I'm loved. I'm good. That's not our monologue. Most of our monologue is if I don't do it, I'm shit, right? I'm not worth anything. I'm of no value to people. And if I'm doing really well, man, now I'm worth it, right? They're going to love me extra because look at everything that I've done and I've proven it and I've earned it. Now, trust me, I'm an Enneagram 3, so I would almost rather earn it than just accept. I should take the almost out. I'd rather earn it. I can't reduce my self-worth and human value to production. When we find ourselves identified entirely by whatever the bricks and straw it is that we're putting together to make our life, we have become a doing instead of a being. And we've got to figure out how to walk that back. So slavery for freedom, leaving control for faith. This is one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. The cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Sort of ancient GPS. You don't get a map, or what, when I was a kid, we drove one time from Florida to Sunday River, Maine, and this was before cell phones, and my dad had a triptych, right? This has been like totally charted out. The Israelites leave, and what they get is like, and this is, you get a cloud. Okay, right? Or it's dark out and you get fire. And one of the things that struck me about the story that does every time I read it is that it's not, I think the harder thing for me would not be trusting the signs, but trusting the stillness. It is paralyzing for me not to be moving. And this is back to doing, right? And so if I'm camping out and the cloud's not moving, I'm not going to make it an hour before I go, man, we could be making good time. We could be covering more ground. We could be, right? Because I've heard the promises about the promised land, and it sounds pretty great, and it's pretty awful here, and we're in the desert, and we have no idea. Like, does this cloud really know what it's doing? Should we really trust the fire? Should we just kind of go out on our own? Maybe we'll send a scouting party out because they may be able to find something the cloud doesn't know. Right? On and on and on. So I think trusting sitting still as much as you trust sort of the obvious sign. Because, right, it's easy if somebody says, oh yeah, when the cloud moves, move. Well, when the cloud's moving, that's great because we're doing something. And there's that sense of, we talked, I think, on Tuesday at Occupy about the web of indecision, which is part of that sitting still. And how much of that is, we sort of went back and forth, how much of that is actually wisdom and then how much of it is paralysis? Moving versus the inability to move. Just sort of some fascinating stuff for reflection. So control for faith. Similar, leaving certainty for trust. The story of manna, I don't think it actually said it in the story, but the translation of the question, what is it, is actually the Hebrew word manna. The name of the bread is what is it, or whatever it is, flaky substance. So typical themes here as well. We, at some level, know that we have to be, and this is so hypocritical, right? Because I'm having conversations this week about refinancing our house and about retirement accounts and, right, looking at the future and knowing that there's enough. And this story is about trusting day by day and about the folly of thinking that you can store things up. But it makes sense when you understand the context of the story that they came out of a scarcity culture and a scarcity mindset, and what came before this story was a story of famine. And so when they're faced with, this is what you get for today, of course they grab as much as they can, right? They want to store it up because they are so insecure with how things are going to be in the future. And so leaving certainty for trust for them more specifically is about leaving scarcity for trust in abundance, that there is enough, that the world is a generative place, that there will be bread tomorrow, right? And you may not get bread for the next month, but you get bread for tomorrow, and then you get bread the day after that. And one of the things I realize is that it is really hard to get to a place of trust if you live in a cycle of fear. Fear and trust are really mutually exclusive. And I've shared this before from my experience in recovery. My first sponsor says there's two kinds of fear of not getting what you want, and fear of losing what you have. And so in some sense, these are both operative in the story because it starts out with people who are terrified of not getting out of slavery. They're terrified not to be free. We might not get what we want. We might not get to the promised land. But then they get out into the wilderness and they immediately start complaining. They say, we should be back in Egypt because there at least we knew where our meals came from every day. So they're both terrified of not getting what they want and at the same time terrified of losing what they have. You can't hope in a situation like that. You can't trust in a situation like that. We're sort of trapped in that web of fear. And so there's some question about how it is that we practice being free enough of fear that we can begin to trust, that we can begin to live a day at a time, that we trust that what we need tomorrow, we'll have tomorrow, even if we don't get guarantees about storing it up. Leaving despair for hope. This comes from that sense, I would imagine if you've built bricks from straw every day for all of your life. No one probably has to say it for you to believe that today is every day. That how it is today, it will always be this way. And without having to get like melodramatic, living in that kind of despair, that things will never change, that the life that I have today is the life that I'll always have. It's always going to be this way. And you think about the hope it must have taken to resist enough to consider leaving, to consider resisting this empire that had enslaved you your entire life, to go against this oppressive force that had kept you in bondage. And I think we read it, and when we read it like a story, because we have Hollywood and Disney and we've got, superheroes, we might think it's so obvious, right? Like, yeah, of course they'd leave because they're living in this terrible situation. Despair, though, that living that way, there's this deeply ingrained sense of despair after having been in that state, in that situation for such a long time. And you start to buy into that. Once a slave, always a slave. It's always going to be this way. And at some level, almost like Stockholm syndrome, right? It goes beyond just being familiar, and it becomes something you depend on. We talked on Tuesday about the different Egypts of our culture, in the ways in which, especially for us, affluent, mostly white, upper middle class, and yet, look at our culture, and in many ways, we're more oppressed than ever. And a lot of the way that we're oppressed is by despair. Not overt slavery, but more in bondage to the things that oppress us with despair. And as Jurgen said, we have to name them. We have to name them so that we can see them, so that we can say these really important words that God has heard the cry, so that we can say to each other, let my people go, so that we can practice this. Let's have a meal together. Let's start walking together. Do we know where it's going to end up? No, we don't know, but we know we have to start walking away from this. And I think a lot of this despair in our culture that doesn't know socioeconomic distinction has to do with addiction and depression and anxiety and self-harm. And you can be an upper middle class, white, affluent, educated person and be in bondage to all these things at the same time. And in many ways, maybe more so likely because you're not gutting it out to survive. And so you have time to wrestle with this stuff. And I think the message is the message as it always has been, which is God hears the cry of the oppressed. Can we get away from, I can't remember who asked this on Tuesday, can we get away from the messaging of Egypt long enough to hear a different story? And it's hard when we live in it, right? Because the Egypt we're living in now doesn't use slave drivers and whips and chains, and we're not making bricks, but it uses billboards and the internet and Facebook and the radio and TV, right? It's all around us all the time. Can we get away from that messaging about who we are long enough to hear a different story? Leaving, arriving for wandering. For me, this is about becoming, which I think, as much as we think that's sexy and we think that that's really neat, like, oh, it'd be neat to sort of just like trust that we could become. We'd rather like know. We'd rather have a fixed point of arrival. We'd rather have certainty. We don't like ambiguity. And a lot of this, I think, comes from the stories that we've been told. And a lot of this is the American dream and the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I learned this, I think, in algebra, right? And it's called rise over run. You do this, life does this. You do this, life does this. And so if I perform, and this is back to doing, if I perform, how does life work? up and to the right. Get good grades, go to a good school. Go to a good school, get a good job. Get a good job, make a lot of money. Make a lot of money, get the stuff you need. Get the stuff you need, get the people around you that you want. People around you want, become a politician. No, I'm not going to go there. Right? That's how life works. And we buy into this, that life is predictable and fair and causal. If I do this, life owes me. And we say life, but a lot of times theologically what we mean is God. If I do this, and especially if we've tried to justify it with the Bible or a religious tradition, if I do this, God will do this. And especially if I do this for God, God sure as hell better do this, right? Because that's how it works. And so we buy into this story that life is transactional. And again, this has been taught to us by generations of making bricks in Egypt. Life is transactional. My behavior is currency. And it's only when I do enough that I get enough. And life goes up and to the right. And this is sort of the epitome of karmic debt, right? If I do good, I get good. If I do bad, I get bad. The problem is then we live, right? Then we have human experience, and we realize very quickly, wait a minute, this is not how things work, right? Because I did that and it tanked, right? Or I did that and like my whole entire understanding of God fell apart. Or I paid the currency of my effort and things went in a totally different direction from what they were supposed to do. My marriage, my kids, my job, my relationships, my career, my friends. And in a lot of ways, what we mean is, I had a beautiful plan for their life, but they kept screwing it up. And we find that especially when it comes to people, and we try to practice this transactional currency way of living, inevitably it fails, especially when it comes to people. I was doing premarital counseling, doing it with a few couples now, and I was thinking this week, we were sort of talking through the curriculum that we go through, and I realized that there's this, and I think this also has to do with Codependence Anonymous, but it's the Serenity Prayer that I've picked up in recovery with Alcoholics Anonymous. And I decided that I'm going to start doing this prayer at every wedding that I do. And I'll just call it the wedding prayer or the marriage prayer, but it's really simple. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, which is my partner, the courage to change the things that I can, which is myself, and the wisdom to know the difference, which is marriage. Right? Which is any human relationship. That relationship between people does not work up and to the right. You don't put in your input and get someone else's output. It doesn't work like that one-on-one in a relationship. It doesn't work that way in the world in which we find ourselves. These people cry out, they leave. And I think a lot of times, even if we've read the whole story and we understand the nuance, and even if we understand that they leave, they're promised that they're going to go to the promised land, they leave, we sort of skip and we go, oh yeah, so they leave Egypt and they go to the promised land. But they don't pass go and immediately arrive at the promised land. They wander for 40 years. It's not up and to the right. Like if we plotted it, it looks like spaghetti. They just wander and wander and wander. And as soon as you think they're close, they turn around and go the other way. For 40 years, which is just a Hebrew way of saying for a very long time or a lifetime. A lifetime of wandering, a lifetime of coming to terms with the fact that life does not operate transactionally, rise over run, up and to the right. It's not how it works. Leaving fixing for joining. For me, this is about solidarity. I like that Moses joins the people, right? Because he comes from the people, but then really by the time he comes back to set them free, he's upper echelon. He's in league with the Pharaoh and the empire, but he goes and joins the people. When it comes to things like racial reconciliation, dismantling racism in our time, being liberated from systems and behaviors of racial injustice, we have to know that especially for white people, it is not our job to perpetuate what is probably very well-intentioned but ill-advised, the posture of white savior, right? It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. We can't fix this. And maybe what is best is that we figure out what it means to join our brothers and sisters who are living in the reality of racial inequality, living and suffering under the reality of white privilege? How is it that we achieve solidarity with people who are suffering rather than trying to stay where we are and fix it? How do we avoid fixing it and instead ask, what does it mean to join? We can't sit in a room full of mostly white people and fix racism. If that's a bummer for you, I'm sorry. We have to figure out how to live with people, experiencing all manner of Egypts, and to join them and to walk together with them out of these oppressive places into unknown freedom. When I say unknown freedom, I mean that. We can't articulate what freedom looks like and feels like for people who are oppressed because we're not with them. But we have to figure out how to join them. And so in a lot of ways, these binaries and distinctives of us and them who are suffering from racial injustice, them must become us. And I love that in the story, that's what Moses does, right? He doesn't come and spend all of his time in the palace with Pharaoh and say, let's have some diplomatic meetings about letting these people go. He joins the people. He's with the people. When they leave Egypt, he walks out of Egypt with them. Together. Solidarity. Let them go must become let us go. And he stakes his life on it, right? When the Egyptians are chasing the Israelites, Moses is not apart from them in some sort of diplomatic delegation that says, oh, yeah, they tried to escape. You should definitely catch them and punish them. And then we'll go have meetings back in Pharaoh's palace. He's with them. When the army descends on them, it descends on him. Leaving survival together for life together. Same kind of thing. Some of us for all of us. This is one of the things Brian McLaren said 3 or 4 books ago. But we have to get past these binaries of us and them and recognize that the call of our tradition, the deepest call, is some of us for all of us. And it goes back to the story of Abraham. A tribe to bless all the tribes. Some of us for all of us. And in the story, it says when they left Egypt, they left as an Erev Rav, which is a Hebrew phrase for mixed multitude. Could be translated loosely a motley crew or a misfit faith community. And I think it's important to recognize that it is not an individual liberation, but that it's communal. Let them go. Let us go. Let those people go. And back to where we started. A lot of where the Christian tradition has lost its credibility and its power and its influence is that we've been talking for so long about individual salvation, right? We're living in a country that is suffering from the most severe racial injustice maybe ever, and the church is talking about you saying a prayer so that your soul can go somewhere when you die. What are we doing? What are we doing? Throughout the Gospels, there are these allusions and nods and hints to Jesus as a new Exodus, the Passover lamb, the new Moses, sort of all of this Exodus imagery, which would have been so familiar to him and to the tradition he comes out of. One of the hard parts of any new beginning is that very often the people that begin the movement, that begin the journey, they don't get to finish it. And this is part of the story of the Exodus, is that Moses comes in and kicks things off. He speaks prophetic words of freedom. He joins the people. He walks with them out of Egypt. They wander together for 40 years, and they get to the edge of the promised land, and Moses doesn't get to go in. Gets right to the edge, and he doesn't get to go. And Jesus comes along and inaugurates this movement and speaks prophetic words of freedom and wanders with these 3 and with 12 and with 72 and with 5,000 out in the wilderness. And like Moses, he dies before it's fully realized. But before he dies, he says that the people that come after him are going to do even greater things than he's done. That they're going to continue the movement he started. That probably they're going to keep wandering for a while, but that's going to be good. We get to continue that journey. We get to figure out what the promised land even is, but more importantly, how it is that we live in it. The Exodus becomes the primary narrative of the Hebrew Bible, this sort of meta story for shaping Israel's self-understanding, their consciousness, their identity. And part of the reason we know this is that if you read the Old Testament, what you read a lot is remember, 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 I am your God who brought you up out of Egypt. Remember, I brought you out of Egypt. Remember, remember, remember. You get the sense these people are forgetful all throughout. Remember, I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt. Brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt. And a part of how they remember is to commemorate the meal, right? We read the text. They slaughter a lamb. They put blood on the doorposts and the lintels. It becomes the Seder meal, the Passover. This was to help them to recall, to remember, to never forget that they had been in slavery and that they were set free, that God liberated them, first from Egypt, but then from themselves. Yes, from slavery. Yes, from Pharaoh. Yes, from making bricks all day, every day. But also from the slavery of control and certainty and despair and fixing and merely surviving. And then Jesus, who's a good Jew and celebrates the Passover, he believes in the Passover so much that he changes it. He adds this other layer of depth. He aligns himself symbolically with this Passover lamb. So the night before he's killed, he takes bread, gives thanks, and he breaks it. And he says, "This is my body." And with the cup, he says, "This is my blood." This wasn't new. They had this meal every year. Everyone knew what the meal meant. But he adds this layer of depth. And just like the Passover, what does he say? Remember. Remember, 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 remember. And just as the lamb isn't saving us from sin, but the meal that inaugurates a journey out of slavery into humanity, into becoming, into a new identity, into freedom. It is not so simple as a meal where you can take a piece of bread and dip it in the cup and you get some sort of convenient personal salvation, some sort of convenient personal liberation. But like the meal that Jesus was remembering, like the meal to which he adds depth and asks us to remember, it's an invitation to participate in a community of liberation, external, internal. And it's a meal that invites us to be realistic, to be honest. Jesus isn't going to save us from the Egypt of racism. But I think that he calls us to remember a way of life that just might help us as we wander. And maybe in wandering, we might wander beyond the Egypt of racism. We could leave that behind. We could discover a land of humanity and trust and freedom and faith and wandering and joining and living together. It's a new beginning, but it's not a new beginning so simple as walking out of a literal Egypt, but a new beginning forged of the practice of this kind of life. And it's not a life of just more doing, but it's a life of discovering being, beginning with the admission that we don't know. We don't know, but we want to know. This is my favorite part of the whole story. Notice how they eat the meal. They're dressed for a journey. They've got their shoes on. They got a walking stick. And I get the sense that they eat standing because they know that the journey's about to kick off. There's like a sense of electricity and energy and hope and anticipation. You get the sense that freedom is so close for these people that they can taste it. It's the table of this freedom, external and internal, that's been set for us tonight. As always, it's open to us and to all people, and no one will ever be turned away. If you'd like, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.